you very much, and it's extremely nice to be here and to have this slot when everyone's ready to go, middle of the afternoon. Hope so. I think this is going to fit quite nicely with some of the things we've already heard. I'm going to have to run through it quite fast, and I'm afraid there's nothing empirical in this. I'm just going to give you some ideas and show you really that if we want to take seriously this notion that the world and how we are in the world is important to cognition, we don't just have to think more carefully about interaction, but we have to throw away our naive views of language, our naive views based on describing language in relation to texts. That's the problem that we all have. We're all deeply literate, and we tend to think about language in relation to text. So I'm going to talk about languaging and explain how I'm talking about it. I'm never quite sure if I should identify or not identify with enactivism. I was delighted to hear Tom say this morning that he's becoming more of a direct realist. I too am more of a direct realist. I take for granted that there's one world. We don't know much about it, but we're in it, and various things happen there. And I'm going to talk about the two orders of the human world that emerge by doing things with language. And my basic message and my paper can be summarized by what I'm about to gesture, and I'm going to come out here and do it. The basic paper is that I'm at the moment doing some languaging, and you're doing some languaging too, that it's measurable activity and something you might be synchronizing with me, and I'm doing various kinds of coordination. But that has a substructure of what it feels like for me to be doing it here and now, sort of trying to hold up my talk. And I'm going to talk about that in relation to interactivity. And interactivity should be something that fits with the general theme that we've just had from Roger, for example. When we think about people as signalling, we think about it in a terribly crude way. It's much more than signalling. And then Didier later on is going to talk about the superstructure of language, which is how we function under collective constraints. And he's going to talk about how Breton-speaking people function under collective constraints. And I want to suggest that it's this complex notion which is central to being human. And that's really what my paper is. And now let's see if I can do it. To an extent, I'm just presenting my view. To an extent, I'm presenting the view of a community called the Distributed Language Group. And we started off rather like the enactivists started off. We rejected code views of language in much the same way as you've rejected symbolic views of mind. And I suppose the question is, are they two tunnels which pass each other, or do they come out in the same place? And the fundamental idea is that languaging exploits many different timescales at the same time. It's not a system which depends on the timescale of the brain fundamentally, or something like that. As we heard beautifully from Fred, I'm doing the languaging. There's not a something before and then the execution, but of course I'm doing it in ways that were rehearsed, for example. I'm doing it in ways that echo other voices, other words, other ways of speaking. So you can think about language as evolutionary, as belonging to populations, as belonging to groups, as enacting relationships, as in interaction, as having to do with how I use my body, with how I manage to articulate the movements I articulate, and with the acts of articulation that make that up. And of course you can go down to the levels of the brain and so on as well. And this leads to a distinction, and I think this is a very useful distinction. It originally comes from the work of Roy Harris, who originally rejected the code view of language, to keep it very simple, that part of what I'm doing is measurable metabolic activity. Quello che faccio è attività, e anche se non capite niente di quello che dico, è linguaggio lo stesso. Even if you don't understand a word of what I'm saying, it's still language, it's still measurable. That's the first order level. Don't confuse language with words. Words are second order historical constructs. Of course, they constrain what we're doing, they constrain your hearing, but in the end they're based on languaging about language. So the first order level is metabolic, the second order level is historical. And we function under historical constraints as we engage with each other. And that's the basic idea which we're pursuing. Now, in a sense, this isn't really throwing out Maturana or even disagreeing with Maturana. It's kind of turning him round. Instead of looking at language and giving rise to a consensual domain or a set of consensual domains of consensual domains, it's saying, well, let's recognize the experiential part of language as having been transformed by the phenomena of sense-making. Let's look at how it is that having been born into, and Tom said something like this morning, the world of language, we become the sorts of agents which we become by learning to exploit the constraints with the kinds of metabolism that we have. And this is not quite the same as his idea of sense-making, but it's closely related, and perhaps we should discuss it afterwards rather than through the paper. So languages, plural, such as English or Breton or Italian, which was the example I used a moment ago, are collective controllers. They exist non-locally, they're not anywhere. We had a very clear description of non-local phenomena earlier on. But when I operate, I must draw on the sorts of normative patterns which are there in order for me to be able to make sense of what I'm saying, let alone for you to be able to make some sense of what I'm saying. And as I become a living, languaging, human kind of agent, I have to learn to exploit those constraints, but I do so by virtue of my capacities to synchronize and coordinate with other people and develop this extraordinarily fine control over my articulatory gestures and indeed the waving and wiggling which goes on around it, although I haven't got much space to do that behind this lecture. So I want you to try to take this concept of languaging seriously, this doing, this measurable, and in typical cases, something which we do together in interaction. In typical cases, it's conversational. And on the one hand, of course, the idea comes directly out of Maturana, who doesn't relate it specifically to humans, but sees it as a very general phenomenon in the world of nature. But by coincidence, I don't suppose it's by coincidence, another person, an American anthropologist by the name of Anton Becker, came up with exactly the same term. He cites Heidegger. One doesn't know quite why he cites Heidegger, because Heidegger didn't write in English, but he does cite Heidegger. And he insists that what is most characteristic about human languaging is that it always has a very particular sense. What's most characteristic about languaging is it always has a very particular sense, and that sense is never exactly the same. And so, to Maturana's broad idea, I want to add that too. I want to suggest that we think of languaging as, if you like, structured coupling, where we perturb each other and ourselves as we go about doing things, engaging in the world as animals do. But at the same time in that activity, there are these wordings which we attune to, which we make something of, and they enable us to give it a particular sense in the context, how things are. And of course the paradigm uses of language are conversational, and arguably we've had conversational language for a couple of 100,000 years, maybe just for 40,000 years. It doesn't make much difference. It's a hell of a lot older than any of the fancy stuff that we typically think about when we take text as our basic model of language. So I'm talking about metabolic, measurable stuff, which includes what I'm doing with my vocal cords and my articulators, but is not restricted to what I'm doing with my vocal cords and my articulators. And so again, and I think this seems to be one of the themes of the conference so far, we need to have richer ways of talking about interaction. We've come up in a tradition with terribly thin ways of thinking about interaction. And we've confused multimodal analysis with multimodality, for example, which is a scandal. And the way in which I and various other people are thinking about interaction is in relation to coordination, and we had a reasonable definition of coordination earlier on, it's when two people do things that are more or less together, such that what one's doing makes sense to the other person. It's a vague sort of concept. We can talk about it as some kind of functional alignment between two people, if you want to be a little bit stricter. But in order to do that aligning, one needs to make specific kinds of movements in specific kinds of ways. And these occur in much shorter timescales. Like the timescale when I said shorter, and as I said shorter, I imagine something quite short. Shorter, probably about 300 milliseconds. It was a long stress signal. Those are the sorts of timescales in which I'm focusing on interactivity occurring. And this notion has been most fully developed, interestingly, in human-computer interaction. This is a slightly amended version of a diagram from David Kirsch's paper, which is referenced on the bottom there. And this is how the individual contributes to the coordination that goes wrong. And if you think about it in terms of a computer screen, you formulate something, you make some sort of movement on the screen, maybe the computer does something back. That gives you some kind of interpretation. I would suggest that's going on all the time as we're doing things together. This is at the core then of first order language. If we want to define it, we can define it as sense-saturated coordination that renders human action and co-action. Sense-saturated in two different meanings of sense. It's sense-saturated in that it's based on our animal nature. It feels like something to be interactive in the world. And of course it's sense-saturated in that it's bound up with meanings and wordings. And the basic argument is then that we don't start with words. Words are not the foundation of language. Interactivity is the foundation of language. And by doing interactivity together, we learn to language about languaging and become part of the cultural world within which we find ourselves. I know it's a bit tricky. I'm sorry. The basic idea is my little one here. The languaging is what we do. It's sustained by interactivity that feels like something, and it's constrained by, in this particular case, my skills in presenting a paper in English with a bunch of external resources. That's the only thing I'm really trying to do. So I'm going to just try and experiment on this interactivity notion by taking you through some slides. I'm not going to show you the video because we're looking at very short timescales, and it won't work in a video, you won't see it. I have to take you through it in the dimension of slides. This is from some work by Chris Baber, who is interested in developing wearable technologies, and specifically wearable technologies in crime scene investigation. And he's done some very simple, interesting work where basically he puts an eye tracker on crime scene investigators, both novice and expert crime scene investigators, and sees where they look. And then he tries to understand what's going on. And in this particular case, which is from a simulation, it's not from a real crime scene, there's an expert investigator who comes into a room where there's been reported to have been a break-in, and she, when she goes into the room, and I'm not going to show you this, she inspects the door, and then I'm going to show you, and I'm going to time it very approximately to give you a sense of how her gaze moves. And the question is, what does she do next as she goes into the room? And it's something very roughly like this. Right? Now, in that time, she works out that it's probably been a put-up job, because there was no sign of forcing either on the door or coming in. Maybe about cash, but possibly not. And there's certainly some very suspicious-looking finger marks on the box. Now, I hope that that strikes you as quite a lot to work out in 13 seconds. It's 13 seconds. Now, I would take that as being a very interesting example of languaging and interactivity. I would argue that she couldn't possibly do it were she not able to language. But she's not saying anything I'm sure most of her thoughts are not made explicit in any way, even to herself. She is a lady, and yet, nonetheless, she's able to put all this together. And there's a huge amount of rich human behaviour which takes place in this kind of timescale with this kind of rich expertise. And we tend to ignore it completely. I actually got here because my early interests were in prosody and how we talk to each other, not the verbal aspect of language, but the sound of language, the tales of sound and fury. I'm married to an Italian lady and we do lots of sound and fury in our house. It's wonderful. It makes you feel so alive. That also functions at that time scale. And so interactivity is part of structural coupling. It's a compatible notion, but it's much enriched by the nature of this human agency that we have. It's the undergirding of the languaging. Didier is going to talk about the overarching constraints in a moment. And of course, it links up the metabolic with the normative. Now, I haven't got time to do this in any detail, but one of the things which gratified me most this morning was Tom talking about the shift to development and focusing on language as something which develops in real time. Here too we find interactivity as being extraordinarily important events in very short time scales. I'm just going to point at stuff which I've worked on myself. We did quite a lot of work with, when I was working in South Africa, with 14-week-old infants. 14 weeks, please notice. That is basically before babies can reach out and put things in their mouths. They are very small babies. And what I suppose struck me most, and I think at least one or two of you in this room have perhaps seen these slides before, was that in this Zulu culture, we found that our Indian and white mothers tended to touch their infants and often to give them their little fingers to hold while they were recording. The Zulus very rarely touched them at all, which was very striking. And in this particular case, the baby in the first slide starts to cry, and the mother, by using very complicated dance-like hand movements and crowding out the infant's face and pointing at the infant and talking to her quite loudly, gets the infant to fall silent. There's a gearing of the activity of the one to the other, shown to people from other communities. Students have said to me, if I did that to my baby, she would cry. That's the interesting part. The baby is already using a concept. Well, the mother certainly thinks so. The mother thinks that this is a respectful, good baby who understands ugoplanipa, which is perhaps one of the core values of Zulu culture. The baby is certainly learning to behave in an appropriate way. And this is 14 weeks. There's no intention reading going on here. There are all sorts of ways you can describe it, but it happens, and it's happening in the timescale of interactivity. So language is grounded first into the brain and whatever enables us to do that sort of behaviour. Of course, because we are born to babble, born to make sense, in the sense of making sense, babies find themselves articulating sounds. This is a cartoon example. Da, 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 it says. So our capacity for sense making is also grounded into acting in ways which are amenable to cultural interpretation. And of course they then beget cultural interpretation. This is phonetic action, getting control over one's gestures. But that's not going to give us language. We need something else as well. And I think, and this is my idea, and I think this is very important. It's an insight from James Gibson. And James Gibson suggests that when we see pictures, and he uses the example of Rorschach dots, and I believe this is the example he used, we don't just see invariance of the picture, that is, it's red and black, for example, but we also see invariance in the picture. And he describes it as bleeding hearts and dancing bears. And so there's this discrepant awareness, which is fundamental to human forms of seeing. I think that also came up today, this ability to see things as. And I want to suggest that it's exactly the same in language, because not only does the baby learn to go da, 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 and so on, but its doting father will say, yes, dada, say dada, baby, and so on. And the baby will gradually come to hear da or dada or daddy or whatever as a wording. It too will use the discrepant awareness. It won't just relate through the interactivity that I've been talking about. It will also develop the capacity to draw on the collective resources, or, as I've suggested in a paper I published in Ecological Psychology last year, to take a language stance. So we get the second order, the language about language, which becomes available to us. And as I said, that's not exactly the same as Tom's sense, but it's exactly the same kind of logic which is being followed through here. So in symbol grounding, we start off with interactivity. We ground language into how it is that we do what people want us to do. We learn to do things and get them to do what we want. And then we start to take a language stance. And this is all techniques. This is all know-how. Now, you may object, I'm only talking about the first 2 or 3 months of the 2 or 3 years of life. But it's still very, very interesting. And we can connect the metabolic with the cultural through this discrepant awareness. One world, 2 orders. I think I probably just about get to the end. If we look at the time scales then, we see something rather interesting. We see that in languaging, the slow dynamics, which have to do with histories, cultures, and groups, tend to be rather dominated by the verbal. And the fast dynamics, which are based in interactivity, play out above all in relationships, interactions, and what it's like to speak. So this is the domain of prosody and gesture, that's the domain of words. And we typically tend to do the 2 things together. And of course, if you take an orthodox view of language, you forget that this is language too. You somehow reify language in terms of the sorts of things that you can see in texts. So we learn to speak in ways which are consonant with, to some extent, the ways in which other people speak. That's what we learn to do. Languages, plural, function as controllers of us, against which we can resist in various ways. And this gives humans their very peculiar kind of eusocial intelligence. It's not on board. I mean, the business about expression is on board, our capacity to control the phonetic gestures that we make is on board, but the what is said depends on our experience of interaction and so on. And of course, the better we do that, and the different ways in which we do that, give us different places in the partly shared world. And that's really just an endorsement of Maturana's view that human languaging is just a form of languaging. It's based on interactivity, which enables us to coordinate in various strategic ways, but we hear those wordings. And through hearing those wordings and making something of those wordings, by learning to make very fine phonetic gestures and in some sense track the phonetic gesturing of other people, we can come under the power of these collective controllers and gradually individuate as the people that we are and install something which is a bit like a self and so on and so forth. And that's the basic distributed view. The nice thing about it is there ain't no representations, except that you can take a language stance and treat things representationally if it suits you. And that's my paper.
We have a few minutes for questions, Joel.
I was wondering if you might say a bit more about the relationship between language and cognition, particularly abstract cognition, because for myself I'm quite happy with the idea that language extends our capacity for abstract thinking and makes perhaps increasingly abstract levels of cognition possible. I get nervous at suggestions that language makes abstract cognition possible in the first place, or one might even go as far as someone like Zoltan Torrey, who says, well, if you don't have language, you don't have any cognition to speak of.
What's cognition in this question?
Well,
The ability to use a brain.
I'm thinking of abstract conceptual cognition in particular, structured thinking, of increasingly abstract
But I mean, I think this is back to what I was trying to understand about your paper this morning. I mean, presumably wolves have languaging, but they have nothing like wordings.
Yeah.
But wolves obviously have a very complex conceptually structured world. And I mean, I think a strong case can be made that and the reason I've chosen wolves as my example is that wolves have, I don't know whether to call them concepts or not, but let's just cheat and say concepts which pertain to the pack, so that a particular road will elicit particular behaviour depending on the time of year that will be shared across the pack. And that sounds pretty conceptual. Now, I would have no problem with suggesting that humans have lots of pre-linguistic concepts of that kind at all. And I would think that that could be pretty much independent of wordings. Now, of course, once you've got wordings, you can change those concepts. I mean, Don Ross talks about how we repartition our semantic space as we take on these habits. And I would be perfectly happy to talk around that kind of way too. So I don't see this as an anti-conceptual view. I mean,
No, I was curious in particular where you were describing the crime scene and the 13 seconds where the inspector pulls out all of these details, and you said if she didn't have language, she wouldn't be able to do any of this. And I was trying to see what exactly it was that the language was.
Well, she knows what to look for. That's the simple way of saying it. And if you didn't have a concept of a crime scene and know that someone had done something bad, you couldn't possibly know what to look for.
But
now, in her case,
you have
knowing
the
what
concept
to
of the crime scene without having any language.
Precisely. Yeah. And a novice who goes in there won't look like she looks because they don't know what to look for in the sense that she knows what to look for. And that's where a history of being a languaging being is crucial. She will probably be thinking, maybe there'll probably be some sort of minimal language going on sub-vocally as she's doing that looking, I would imagine.
Do you think that thoughts are linguistically structured? Oh, sorry.
I think, well, if there was one question you had,
Yeah, I think it's a very quick clarification question, and that is, what, if any, difference do you see between the phrase languaging and sensemaking?
Well, I specifically tried to talk about human languaging here, and I want to suggest that human languaging necessarily depends on wordings, not exclusively, but partly. So even the baby who is being inducted into the world of evolutionary and is completely unable to hear evolutionary is nonetheless involved in languaging and is on the road to becoming a fully fledged human agent. And I would argue that most human sense-making, but not all, think about making passionate love, for example, is infused by language. That's one of the things that makes us so peculiar.
Yeah, that doesn't clear it up for me at all, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
But yeah, we'll talk over coffee.
Part